My name is Edward Dauenhauer, and I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky, and spent the last 20 years living in Campbellsville, Kentucky.
And I'm Rick Albers, and I'm an old retired, and I mean old, fire chief, and I live here in Oldham County, Kentucky.
And I think you've asked us here today to talk a little bit about the history and the passion and the mission of Doug Dauenhauer, which he recently passed away in May of 2017, but spent the last 11 or 12 years dedicated to a mission and a vision that was associated with emergency personnel and education and history of emergency personnel in general. His biggest focus was on his fire collection and the legacy that we've been able to provide the Vintage Fire Museum in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Over the last 11, 12 years prior to his death, he traveled the entire country, made thousands of contacts with local fire departments, chiefs, retirees. His passion was a particular era of fire equipment, apparatus, as well as large-scale, full-scale antique fire trucks. The 40s, late 40s, early 50s was the era that he was most interested in. But his biggest passion outside of the equipment was learning the history and the stories and the dedication that comes from especially the rural fire departments, the dedication they had and continue to have to our communities. He was afraid that the history was going to be lost. He was terribly afraid that as generations continue to pass, that our children and our young people do not have the understanding, the appreciation of what our emergency heroes and responders go through and how they've dedicated themselves to their career and to their communities. He was self-taught in everything that he learned about fire equipment, the vehicles, the apparatus, and he took great care to not only collect but learn the stories. We traveled, and he traveled himself as well around the country, and we would spend days in communities meeting with the retired officers and police chiefs and the community members as well. So there's lots of history and stories associated with this entire collection that he spent 11 or 12 years collecting. Prior to his death, we were actually looking for a building in the Campbellsville-Taylor County area in particular, to where that was going to be the first South Central Fire Museum. That was his goal, especially as he was moving into retirement. And then, of course, unexpectedly, he passed, and I was left with, how do I continue his legacy? What do I do? And that's where I was completely blessed with being introduced to Rick Albers initially from the Vintage Fire Museum in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and C.J. Hounds and the entire board. We spent a lot of time on our property, going through the equipment, the inventory, the vehicles. It took months, absolutely months of engineering, logistical genius planning of how to actually acquire this equipment, move it from Campbellsville. In Campbellsville, we had somewhere, this is also including other emergency vehicles. Doug was just not dedicated to the fire piece. He had old, same era police cars. His plan was to purchase some ambulances and anything associated with the emergency responder piece. So with that said, I had upwards to 45 vehicles between the property and extra storage units out by Green River Lake near Campbellsville, Kentucky, to decide how to disperse and how to make sure that this history is retained. So that's where, Rick Albers, you come in to play, and you had the opportunity to come down and see it all firsthand.
Yep. Well, my blessing was that Mary and I crossed paths, and it was kind of interesting because I had a phone call one day from a fellow named Dick Wilson. And Dick is Mary's financial advisor, and he explained what happened, Doug's tragic loss. And then he says, I've got this woman, she's recently widowed in Taylor County, that has a collection of fire equipment and fire apparatus and upwards of 9 or 10 fire trucks. And he explained the story about Doug and what he had done for years to collect this, and that he said that Mary doesn't want to just dispose of this. She'd like to see Doug's legacy, this taken forward as Doug's legacy and his original mission accomplished. And he said, I got your name from a friend of yours who's a retired police officer. They had lunch, taking him at lunch, and he was recounting this story that my buddy was a retired police officer, and he said, I know somebody who'll take care of that for you. And he threw me under the bus, which I'm glad he did, because I got to meet Mary, and she's a wonderful, sweet person, and then got to go down to her property. CJ and I and several others from the museum went down, and we saw all this stuff. I mean, it was scattered about in different spots, but we would uncover. A couple of them were parked on their property, wrapped in tarps, and it was like unwrapping a Christmas present, And we found all this stuff, and we're just salivating because we love old fire apparatus, and here we've got a treasure trove of stuff. So we started the process that Mary mentioned about the logistics to how do we, she, fortunately, she agreed that, once Dick found me and I told him about the museum, and I called her and we talked on the phone, and we'd never met, but it just seems like in that phone conversation, we just hit it off like it was perfect. So we talked about, I told her what the museum was all about, and she said, well, we're going to just, we'll give this to the museum as a very generous donation. And it was, I think, 9 pieces of fire apparatus, 9 vehicles, 9 trucks, this chief's car, and a plethora of equipment, everything from turnout gear, uniforms, firefighting magazines and books, warning equipment like lights and sirens, ladders,
brass pole,
that's probably the crowning jewel. There was a brass pole removed from an old fire station, which we now have, which we're going to incorporate in the museum's building that they just purchased across the street from the original museum in Jeffersonville, Indiana. But this whole thing materialized because of her generosity and our curiosity, and we've ended up with this wonderful collection. And it was a logistical nightmare almost to get it all up here, but we did it. It took probably 6 months, I guess. We had tow trucks to come, giant tow trucks with, that are rollbacks to load them up on and bring them up. We didn't drive any of them up here, but we had them all brought up and arranged. We made an arrangement with CJ's father, Carl Hounds. This building that we're sitting in was a vacant industrial building on his property, and of course, Carl Hounds is a retired fire chief from the Worthington Fire Department in Jefferson County, and he loves the fire department, obviously, and he was kind enough to lease us this building for $0. And here we are, and we're, we got all the stuff here, and we're starting to work on it, and we've made a lot of progress mechanically and cosmetically with the apparatus, and most of it's in pretty good shape anyway, but have been sitting for a long time, and we had to deal with those inherent issues. But we've used, a couple of them in parades, particularly the chief's car that we've got marked as with Vintage Fire Museum and then red light on it. It's a 1950 Chevrolet coupe, and it gets a lot of it. It is a one of a kind.
And that's what's interesting about this entire collection, including the truck that you've now purchased and you're dedicating the restoration to, is the majority of what is in this collection is now one of a kind because they just haven't been bought to restore, they haven't been kept, and that was Doug's intent, was to find almost one of a kind pieces of equipment that he could personally restore. One of the important things is that whether it's a light on the chief's car or a hatchet or a ladder, he took great care over that 11 or 12 year period in collecting and retaining or wanting to restore every aspect and keep it in its original condition.
And he's done a superb job of that, and that's what we've got. All of these rigs are pretty much original, other than maybe some modifications that the department who had them did. I mean, an example is that we have a 1948 Buffalo quad, which is, first of all, a very rare piece of apparatus. Buffalo fire apparatus was in business, I think, from the early 1900s until about maybe 1940, 50, I think, 1950. So the 48 is 2 years before they went out of business. And it's a rare piece of equipment. There were 4 of those built and in service in departments in Indiana. The one we have now came from Bedford. And it's basically original except for one thing. It was repowered with a diesel engine. I think it's a Detroit 671, yeah. And it sure sounds good when you fire it up. I mean, we went down to get that one going. CJ and I went to Mary's place, and it was wrapped in about 8 tarps and sitting on a driveway behind her house, and she needed it moved because they were coming to do some work back there. And we went down and uncovered it, and the more each piece you take off, you're going, wow. And we did a little work with it and got it started. Diesels will do that. It hadn't run in years, and we fired that thing right up and
drove it right down Bingle Road in Campbellsville, Kentucky.
Went for a spin, and it won't turn in a 5-acre field, but other than that, but I felt right at home because that's the kind of apparatus I came in on, when I started in the fire service.
Yeah, I'll have to overlay a picture through the video, but if you're not familiar, this thing is, how long is that? It's got to be.
We think that's
it's about 50 feet long.
Yeah.
It's I'll try to get a picture to overlay the video later, but it's a very long apparatus. Like I'd say it mirrors even modern aerial trucks in length. So
the American La France.
We had that beautiful American La France pumper over there, 51 American La France pumper that is in 100% original condition, and it's gorgeous. I mean, it was in. Doug had it stored on the vehicle hauler that is sitting behind you here, and it was sitting inside. That was like a storage unit, an RV storage place, and we went over there and Mary unlocked it and raised the door, and we just went, wow.
I didn't tell them what was in it,
oh my,
but I anticipated that they would really be interested.
It's been amazing. Of course, I've been working on this truck on and off. There was no COVID-19 worries when I first saw it, and then of course that really slowed down the timeline. But back to what you were saying of how original everything is, other than what I have seen from the 6-volt generator to the 12-volt alternator conversion, which I'm sure was probably done in the fire hall in Nebraska.
Probably.
Everything is there. It's showing 6,700 miles on that particular truck, and the speedometer was working the other day.
Probably original.
That's
miles.
probably the original miles is around 6,700. So
that's the amazing thing about these old fire trucks is they didn't go very far. You're right, and especially these out in rural areas. That's another thing that's fascinating about this collection is these smaller commercial chassis pumpers. Several of them have front mount pumps, which makes drafting from a pond or something like a creek much easier because you can nose into it. But they're all that represents that early 50s, late 40s, early 50s rural America firefighting, which was I mean, it's still this way in a lot of cases, but those kind of departments have little to no funding, and so an acquisition of a new fire truck like this, at $6,000 back in 1949 or 50 was a lot of money, and it's something they took a lot of pride in, and the pumper was being delivered and the whole town came out to see it. But those people did a lot with a little, and I respect them. And there's still a lot of departments, especially right here in Kentucky, that are like that.
Yeah, probably worth mentioning on that. This is also back in an area, it was expensive at the time, and they had to find the money. There weren't the safer grants.
No.
The federal government didn't show up for most people and say, "Hey, put a bid in, and we'll buy the fire truck for you." This was money. I remember history.
It had to be raised.
Yes, like people that I've talked with when I was younger. Everything from bake sales to, just town fundraising, passing the plate to the local church to get money for the fire truck. So
if you look around, there's a couple of pallets over here full of 5-inch hose and 3-inch, 2.5, and 1.75 that we have gotten. Actually, it's stored here. It's not actually part of the museum, but some friends of mine at the Anchorage Middletown Fire Department, going through and testing all their hose. And that's a recent merger of 5 separate fire departments into one. So it's a huge undertaking. And a lot of the hose is old, and the hose they have a company testing the hose for them. They'll look at it and they won't even test it because of its age, but there may not be anything wrong with it. So we've gotten 3,000 or 4,000 feet of hose from them already, and delivered it to a couple of small departments down in near Campbellsville, and in Taylor County, and in Adair County and Casey County, and they're just thrilled to death because they don't have anything. And these fire departments operate the ones we focus on. The main one we focus on is a little department called Dunville, and Dunville is in Casey County, and it operates on a budget of about $13,000 a year. And of that $13,000, close to 3/4 of it is state aid, which they didn't have that back in those days either. So these people worked very hard to obtain this stuff and keep it running and utilize it, and they took a lot of pride in it. And that's still going on today, because a lot of the stuff that these.
That's the one thing I noticed. Of course, today's the first day I've had a chance to talk with you a lot and get the full history. But just in looking at this particular truck, the 49, the Lindy, Nebraska stuff is still on the dash. The latest registration in the window is for 1982 for vehicle registration. But through some Googling and talking with Lindy, Nebraska no longer actually exists. It's not incorporated.
Right.
Apparently they had some kind of economic boom in the area in 48, 49. So this truck was bought new in 49, and it served that town until 1982 when the town dissolved.
Right.
So
Pretty wild.
And in this era, and when these vehicles were purchased, to your point, Rick, this was a huge community endeavor. Parades, people came out. They were in the newspaper on the front page. When the trucks were acquired, they were ordered, paid for, acquired, and showed up. The whole town turned out. And what's interesting with that is as we traveled around, and Doug traveled around, and I'll use an example, North Dakota. We drove ourselves all the way to North Dakota, about 50 miles from the Canadian border, to pick up one of the fire trucks. When the community found out, it was a community of around 5,000 people, when the community found out that we were coming and we were purchasing their very first fire truck, real fire truck, and what the plan was, the whole town, which at that point was not 5,000 people, but the whole town turned out at the local coffee shop. They had a parade for us. We had our 15 minutes of fame in this little North Dakota town, and everyone was so excited. And some of the original individuals, while they were up in age, they were still alive at the time, and they were able to tell tremendous stories over a cup of coffee with Doug and I, and they had lunch. It was just something so special that says these communities in our rural towns in the United States still have this passion and still believe in what the cause is.
They do.
And with everything that's going on in the world, and especially in the United States, if Doug was here today, he would be so proud and so still focused on this mission of retaining and restoring and protecting this history and these memories. So I'm just going to say, I've been blessed through all of this tremendously. I'm so proud to have known Vintage Fire Museum, the board of directors. CJ and his father have just stepped up. There's nothing like it. So the story of your particular truck fits right in here. When Doug went to purchase this truck, the whole town turned out at the time. You're probably making contacts, Joe, with people that actually Doug made original contacts with. And the world is small, right?
Yes, it is.
And so what's going to be very interesting and very special is, as we continue this history, is how many people remember the engagement that took place and that's still possibly around.
And that's why we're trying to do what we're doing now. And, the documentation is easy these days.
Right.
I've got 2 cameras going and stuff. The world is small, and it's much smaller now than it was even 10 years ago. The phones that are filming this changed a lot of things, but that makes me curious. In a pre-Craigslist, Facebook, social media, when you guys first started collecting, how did you find these trucks in Lindy, Nebraska, and South Dakota? Like it's clear you found them everywhere. New York.
So a couple things. I'll call this fortunate or unfortunate little joke. I am the one that introduced Douglas to eBay. Okay. When eBay first started to become a thing. So eBay, but social preservation societies, right? The fire preservation societies. Doug spent over 30 years with UPS in communications, human resources. He was a researcher. He read a lot. He learned, he was self-taught in so many areas. And when he decided this was his passion and this was going to be his goal, he set out through phone calls, letters. I have a number of examples of letters he wrote. So there's a way to do it pre-Twitter, pre-YouTube, all of Facebook. It was all getting to know people, going to those communities, just getting in the truck in his 350 diesel, taking off and seeing what he discovered.
Yeah, even that way of finding things is probably something worth
preservation. It was almost an early version of American Pickers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Is it? Even I remember. I kind of feel like I'm lucky. The age I'm at, just old enough to remember still using the newspapers and the classified ads, and if you had a friend that you talked to 3 months earlier that had mentioned wanting something and you saw it in your local paper's ad, you clip that out and you would mail it to your friend and be like, hey, this is in my area, that kind of stuff. Whereas, today we get frustrated if we scroll Craigslist or Marketplace and we can't find what we want immediately available in our area. So very, very cool and very amazing to be able to collect all that.
When I first started collecting fire apparatus, actually the first one I ever bought was a 1941 Ford chassis with a Darley pump, and I really don't know who built the body for it, but it was built for the U.S. Army, and I bought that in 1973, and from the former New Albany Township Fire Department in Floyd County, Indiana, and went over and drove it home, and tinkered with that for a couple of years, and that was my first one. But I found that because I saw an ad in the newspaper, in the classified section of the good old Courier Journal. And I said, I've got to find out about this. And I called the old chief over there and went over and looked at it. And I paid a whopping $300 for it. Now, I'll tell you, it was a lot of money back then. And then it just, the ones I had found since then, in the early years was pretty much similar. I mean, either that or it'd go to like a muster that they have some of these antique fire truck clubs. And I found out about SPAMFA and joined it and subscribed. When you join it, you get their magazine, Engine, and all their other stuff. And that was pre-Facebook and all that, pre-eBay. And I started, I'd call somebody up in Canton, Ohio. Hey, you got this? Yeah, well, I want it. And I'd drive for 5 hours up to get it and bring it home. And, and that's how I kind of started doing it. And it just morphed from there. Now I've got 5 fire trucks of my own. And a friend of mine, Lewis Nugent, who's a retired police chief, and he was a former fire chief at North Oldham, where I was chief at the end of my career. Lewis is the one that taught me about eBay, and that's been probably 25 years ago. So I got on eBay, and now my wife says if anything, another fire truck rolls in that driveway, you better be able to sleep in it.
You guys are not allowed to call my wife and tell her about how you bought your first one. Now you have 5. We're going to stick with 1 in my family. That's the plan, at least. If she heard mention that, by the way,
you probably don't want her to talk to me then.
Yeah. So well, we're going to stick with 1 and try to do keep it on the road and stuff. So
that's what I said 40-something years ago. I'm going to stick with 1.
Which that is something unique we're trying to do, or at least I'm trying to do with this one. Of course, we talked a little before we started videoing, but most of the stuff in the collection now will be strictly mechanically good and parade stuff, but we're going to try and take this 49 and it won't be driven a lot, but it needs to be in a condition where I told her eventually what I want to do is I want to drive it back to Lindy and have the truck back in the town that originally bought it and
a few people
have a road trip. So so we'll
make that trip.
Yeah, eventually that'll be a road trip that I hope to make in it once things are, it's a top speed of 45 to 50 miles an hour right now, just because of the gearing and the transmission. Right. So there will be some upgrades that cosmetically you don't notice, but you know they're there. But that's the goal eventually, is to get it. Now that I know where it came from, that see if it can get there and back on its own. But
Well, the Dauenhauer collection has been many years in the making, all the way down. The detail's amazing. We don't have enough time to talk about the level of detail and
we'll break that down to other times.
So.
Well, one thing, and you mentioned it earlier, but the preservation of this history, I find that that's extremely important in all areas of history,
right.
Because I think we're tending to forget a little history now. But I'm passionate about fire service history and fire apparatus and stuff, because I think so many people now focus on what's going on today and the technically advanced new fire apparatus that's got fully enclosed cabs and air conditioning, all this stuff that we didn't have back in the day, and they don't realize that firefighters today are young, and they don't realize where it has evolved from. And I think it's important.
And they don't realize and recognize the sacrifice
exactly
that has been made.
Exactly. I mean,
and that kind of overflows into the whole military piece and all of that. So
it's kind of funny how things come back around too. A lot of them don't realize where they came from, but a lot of the things we're back to teaching and doing.
Yes, we are.
Are the things that were the standard in the day when this truck was built, and we got away from it either via good marketing by someone who bought something or that kind of thing. But back to basics. What worked then still works now if you just properly apply the techniques.
That's the thing. If you take a brand new $600,000 or $700,000 pumper and park it out here, and then pull one of these old ones out next to it, you'll see a distinct difference. But if you look closely, you'll see a lot of the same things.
The principles are the same. It's
same principles, same. It's the same thing wrapped differently.
Yes.
So before we close, I want to make sure that CJ has an opportunity to say a couple of words, because the impact in what he and his father and family have had.
We wouldn't be here able to do this
restore
without
this
him and his dad, I can tell you that.
Yeah, you wouldn't be here restoring the vehicle you have now.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, but quite honestly, this story is more about you and the interaction that you've had with Vintage Fire Museum and with all the work that you and Rick have put into allowing Vintage Fire Museum to acquire these apparatus and all this equipment, to supplement and grow our collection. It just happened to be that from my dad and I's perspective, our family business was kind of handed a lemon in that we had some vacant buildings and no purpose for them at the time, and at the same time was about when I started really getting active with Vintage Fire Museum, and so put two and two together. When I found out through Rick that we were now looking at acquiring the Dauenhauer collection, but the Vintage Fire Museum was not in a position to have a place to store it, then I approached my dad about this, and he said, well, sure, we're not utilizing this building. It would work perfectly for it. So, I approached the board of the museum and told them that, hey, we have the ability to utilize this building on a temporary basis, and the rest is history. Here we are, we're in the building for the foreseeable future until the Vintage Fire Museum has an opportunity to complete acquiring and renovating some new property at the Jeffersonville location. And as part of the acquisition of that building and its upfit, we plan on organizing the space such that a lot of what is stored here in Oldham County can be moved to Jeffersonville and displayed in such a way that hopefully when you look at it, you'll see that we are really paying good homage to to Doug and your contribution to the history of the fire service. So we have a lot of plans for that. Of course, having just acquired that building, we're right now in a planning phase, and hopefully, if we meet again on video in a year or two, we'll look back and say, "Wow, we've come a long way toward making this, this goal a reality.
Well, you've been a huge part of this from the start, so don't
So
slight
thank you.
yourself. You've been this. If you hadn't stepped up, we wouldn't have this here.
Well, I appreciate that.
We owe you a lot, and you still are a big part of it because you're spending a lot of hours and time working on the equipment and getting it organized, cleaned up, and mechanically solid, and mainly safe. Because you were talking about being able to start it up and drive it. There's two most important things: be able to start it, make it go, and then make it stop and steer it. So.
Well, that one didn't have that problem. That one,
Yeah.
there,
It wouldn't roll.
You couldn't unstop it.
That's
So.
right. But CJ's done so much. He's a brilliant mechanical person, and among other things, and he's done a super job with this, and all for free. I mean, that's the thing. We're all volunteers.
That's the big thing is probably
kind of like the people that rode this truck. I mean,
Yeah.
these little tiny towns were all volunteer fire departments. They couldn't afford a salary, so like I said, they did a lot with a little. So.
cool. Well, in closing, is there? There may or may not be. I don't know. But is there anything, just in particular, here with the 49? This truck in particular, like any story with the acquisition or how you found it, or anything that's directly related to this one?
So it's difficult for me to close the gaps on each and every one of these. This one originally, I think you already mentioned, was from Nebraska. He acquired, I will tell you this little detail. He acquired this one while I was out of town working.
I know that. I know how that works.
So
I've gotten in
when I
trouble for that.
arrived back home, it was here. So I did not take the trip with him, but I know that he went to Nebraska. He acquired it. He was very excited about it to add it to the collection. I'm believing that it was probably acquired somewhere around 2006 to 2008 time frame. And again, we have boxes and boxes of paperwork and articles and handwritten information and letters and stories to go through once we start going through that and starting to put the stories to each one of these vehicles. So maybe the next time we get together, we'll have a little bit more information. But yeah, he got in his truck, he identified it, he located it as a piece that he wanted in his collection, and he hit the road. And sometimes I knew about it, and sometimes I didn't.
And obviously,
better to ask for forgiveness and permission.
Obviously, since I had known about this one, the rear brakes were locked up, the shoes. But when he acquired it, it was driving, correct?
It was driving when he acquired it, and then because, like any equipment, it sits
It's
long
storage. Yeah.
in storage. You're going to have some problems, especially older equipment like this. So this was probably one of the most difficult of the 9 or 10 vehicles to get off the property because the brakes were locked up.
It's funny. It's really simple stuff, but it's a big deal if it won't roll. That was
Right.
I know when me and CJ started talking, it's like, yes, I'm very interested, but I need to make sure that we can get the rear freed up before I decide to make a purchase. Because if I can't do that, I can't do anything else with it.
But if Rick and CJ will recall, once we realized we really needed kind of an engineering plan and a logistical plan of moving all of this, and living in rural Kentucky and rural America for as long as I did, networking and friends paid off.
Yes.
Not soon after we realized what we were faced with, the cavalry came.
Yeah.
So the local neighbors with tractors and trucks, and in fact, I think it Jack that came over to me and leaned over, especially trying to get this one out of the barn. He said, "Mary, I'm impressed. You got the cavalry here in less than 30 minutes."
You did. She called. She did.
I made phone
That
calls.
was Jack Monahan that said that. Yeah, it was pretty funny.
And so this was one of them. The brakes were locked up, and we had to literally drag it out of the barn.
The good news was it was simply just long-term storage, and the parking brake was set apparently.
Right.
So
that was stuck.
Like I said, we talked. I think it was. We had probably three full days in here. But we started off with the little hammers, then we got bigger hammers, and then we brought the very large
And then you got the sledgehammer.
Yeah.
And it was fun. We never didn't want to break anything, so
Right.
I posted a video about us getting the brakes free, and there was some guy who's like, I'm ASC certified diesel master mechanic, blah blah blah. Your hammer's not big enough, but that's probably key. Something I pointed out in the comments was that's great if you're working in a big shop with parts readily available, and you're working for a production time where your labor rate could be hundreds of dollars per hour for a mechanic. It's a different story when you're trying to do it for yourself and you don't want to tear things up. You don't resort to the sledgehammer right away. And luckily, we didn't have to get to that. It was light hammers, and then we did the heating with the torch several cycles, and then it still didn't free up enough that we could do it with pry bars. But he went and got the tractor, and it had been dragged around before and didn't free up. But then after the tapping around and the heat cycles, it finally freed up, and it groaned a lot. It was very.
But it came back to life.
It did. It voiced its displeasure with stretching its legs, but like I said, the other day we drove around out here for an hour and kept working the brakes, and it was driving great. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, but,
so, and
awesome.
this you've purchased it, you're restoring it, but it'll be part of the bigger
Yeah,
picture.
it'll be part of it.
once,
yeah, and it always ties back to it's
the
you know.
museum.
When I purchased this, I'm not a part of the Vintage Fire Museum, but by default, I will.
You're
mention
part of the
I will
legacy.
be involved.
Yeah.
The truck will come back. I'm
You're
sure
part
at
of the
some point.
legacy.
You're a firefighter. Fire
Yeah.
service is a big family. So
So
it's a
I got
museum. So
I've got a couple other big projects. Actually, that was the whole point of purchasing this. I wanted a 55 or earlier
Mm-hmm.
because of the steam engine project. So, but once that's running and caught up, maybe put some time in, or maybe just even a day or two to come work on the building, kind of pay it forward.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things we didn't mention is what's interesting about Doug's collection is that it really complemented the museum. So this truck that you purchased from Doug's collection, fits right in with that because it really closed the gap on the generation and the era of fire.
because we had
fighting.
the original Fred Conway collection that had vehicles up to, I think the latest was in the 30s, maybe, and then we skipped all the way to some of the other stuff we had was in the 70s. So this kind of closes that gap.
Filled in a few decades worth.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
And the only thing I want to say is that there's other people, I just like to mention them, that played a big part in getting us up here. Jack Monahan, Ken Rabinek, Tim Robbins, J.B. Lesher. Who am I forgetting? Anybody else? There was.
Oh gosh, there's so many people involved in this
Yeah.
project. It's hard to remember
It is.
everybody.
it's always regrettable. Like I said, with the other things I've done too, it's.
And Randy Reed. Randy came
so
down.
many people involved. It's hard to keep up. That's why I'm trying to video this stuff and at least have the name spoken and capture that. So it's like, who was that guy? What's his name? I noticed, we moved that steam locomotive across the state just last year,
That was cool.
and we were looking for some guys from the railroad, CSX, and places that were just the employees. And there's a couple guys that was like, last year we were good friends, and the name's already slipped because time flies. So. I don't want that happening.
When you
that
get
kind of
nice,
stuff, so.
names will slip all the time.
Names have never been my thing anyway. It's
Yeah.
it's a good thing the department puts your name on your shirt.
right.
I wouldn't know anybody.
I have to look at my name tag.
Yeah.
Remind me who I am.
That's always one of my favorite things to do is walk around and cover your name and see who really knows you when you're working. But
Well, finally, I would just say I thank you for having the interest and the desire and the dedication to restoring one of these pieces. Of
glad to find it because I know, like I said, I've been looking for a couple of years, really since about 2017, since we started the steam engine thing. I was like, I want a fire truck to go with it. And the big problem is, it's a problem on one front. The smaller trucks, the 3500s and less, they're decimated. Either the price is so high for parts, or they've been cut and chopped and made hot rods and other things, not sustainable. It's hard to find them in original condition. The flip side is the fire apparatus. Really, it's usually the bigger chassis, but they're very underappreciated. You can find it's unrestored 6,700 miles and sitting original, but people don't think about it, and unfortunately, a lot don't get saved like your husband did, and they wind up sold for pennies on the dollar and scrapped.
It's heartbreaking when that happens, especially if it's a beautiful piece of fire equipment. Fire apparatus.
Well, I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you. And I
glad to.
hope we could go forward and maybe cover some other pieces as things happen and progress.
Absolutely.
That'll cover me and my little project. But like I said, as far as the fire museum and stuff, more than
But
happy
it'll add to the fire museum story.
Oh, yeah.
All right. We hope you enjoyed this special episode here on the Fiery 49 page.
We felt it was important to include these stories relevant to the history of the truck, in addition to the mechanical videos we've been releasing. Of course, a huge thank you goes out to Mary Bauer Dauenhauer, Rick Albers, CJ Hounds, and all of the crew at the Vintage Fire Museum for their willingness to speak with us, share their stories, and for their efforts in preserving all the historical pieces in the collection. If you'd like to know more about or plan a visit to the Vintage Fire Museum, make sure to hit up their website at vintagefiremuseum.org, where you can find more information on current hours of operation, locations, and special events.